What if I told you that in 1975, a group of scientists officially documented a crop that could have changed how the world eats, farms, and feeds itself? And then, almost immediately after, that knowledge faded into obscurity. Not because it was disproven, not because it failed, but because it didn't fit the system that came next. This wasn't folk wisdom or a rumor passed down through generations. It was a published scientific report by one of the most respected scientific institutions in the United States. The data was real. The conclusions were clear, and the implications were uncomfortable. The scientists involved weren't trying to reinvent agriculture. They were trying to solve a problem that was already obvious by the 1970s: hunger, malnutrition, soil degradation, and growing dependence on chemical inputs. To do that, they examined plants that had been grown quietly for centuries in parts of the world industrial agriculture rarely paid attention to. Crops that worked without massive infrastructure. Crops that fed people reliably. Crops that didn't require constant external support. One plant stood out so clearly that the language used to describe it was unusually direct. The report referred to it as a complete food source. They described it as a supermarket growing from a single plant. Nearly every part of it was edible. It produced large amounts of protein. It grew in poor soil, and it fertilized itself. That last detail mattered more than most people realize, because fertilizer is not just a farming input. It is an entire industry tied to fossil fuels, global trade, and recurring dependence. A plant that doesn't need it doesn't just grow food. It changes the economics of farming. Before naming this plant, it's important to understand why this matters to you right now. Today, food prices are rising. Fertilizer costs fluctuate wildly. Supply chains fracture under pressure. Farmers are locked into cycles of annual purchases. Consumers are told that complexity is unavoidable, that nutrition requires global logistics, and that food security depends on fragile systems functioning perfectly at all times. Most people accept this because it's all they've ever known. But in 1975, scientists documented a crop that quietly contradicted that narrative. A crop that produced its own nitrogen through natural biological processes. A crop that delivered complete protein without the need for animal agriculture. A crop that regenerated soil instead of exhausting it. If that crop had been scaled, many of the costs and dependencies people now consider normal would not be. The plant is known as the winged bean. Scientifically, it's called Psophocarpus tetragonolobus. It's a climbing legume native to Southeast Asia, cultivated traditionally for generations, and briefly illuminated by modern science before fading back into the background. What makes the winged bean remarkable is not a single feature, but how many systems it replaces at once. The seeds contain roughly 35 to 40% protein by dry weight, placing them in direct competition with soy, long considered the gold standard of plant protein. The amino acid profile is complete, meaning it doesn't require careful combination with other foods to meet nutritional needs. The leaves are edible and rich in minerals like calcium and iron. The flowers can be eaten. The young pods are consumed like green beans. Beneath the soil, the plant produces edible tubers with protein levels far higher than common root crops like potatoes. 5 distinct food sources from one organism. Not as a novelty, but as a normal, growing pattern. Then there is the soil. Like other legumes, the winged bean forms a symbiotic relationship with nitrogen-fixing bacteria. These bacteria live in nodules on the roots and pull nitrogen from the atmosphere, converting it into a form plants can use. When the plant grows, sheds roots, or completes its life cycle, that nitrogen remains in the soil. The result is fertility without purchase, improvement instead of depletion. Globally, hundreds of billions of dollars are spent every year producing and applying synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. That fertilizer requires large amounts of energy to manufacture, contributes to environmental damage, and gradually degrades soil structure. The winged bean does not eliminate fertilizer use entirely, but it proves that fertility does not have to be bought every season. That idea alone challenges an enormous economic structure. After the report was published, research trials were conducted in multiple regions, including Southeast Asia, parts of Africa, and the Pacific. The results were consistent. Yields were strong. Nutritional value was confirmed. Indigenous farmers, who had been growing and eating the plant for centuries, saw nothing surprising in these findings. To them, the plant had always delivered. The logical next step would have been widespread agricultural extension programs, education, seed distribution, integration into local food systems. That step never came. Instead, funding slowed, research narrowed, attention drifted elsewhere. To understand why, you have to look at what was happening in agriculture at the same time. The late 1970s and early 1980s marked a major shift toward crops that could be patented, chemically managed, and sold on a recurring basis. Within a few decades, genetically modified soy and corn dominated global agriculture. These crops required proprietary seeds, chemical fertilizers, herbicides, and constant repurchasing. They fit perfectly into an industrial model built on predictability and recurring revenue. The winged bean did not. It could be saved, replanted, shared. It required little external input. It did not lock farmers into annual dependency. From a business perspective, could not create customers. It created independence. Independence rarely attracts investment. So the winged bean was not banned. It was not declared unsafe. It was not publicly criticized. It was simply excluded from the future that was being built. Silence became policy. And silence is often more effective than opposition. If people never learn something exists, it never needs to be argued against. Today, the winged bean still exists. It is preserved in seed banks. It is grown by small farmers. It appears in backyard gardens. The knowledge never disappeared completely. It was just never amplified. You can still grow this plant. It prefers warm conditions and a long growing season, but it adapts surprisingly well with enough time and support. It thrives in poor soils. It climbs fences, trellises, and neighboring plants. Once it begins flowering, it produces food continuously for months. It was never illegal. It was never restricted. It was simply not promoted. Small seed suppliers still carry it. Traditional growers still use it. The barrier has never been access. The barrier has always been awareness. We are living in a period of increasing instability. Food systems are fragile. Inputs are expensive. Supply chains are vulnerable. Nutritional advice is confusing and often contradictory. The winged bean does not solve all of this, but it proves something important. Some solutions were already documented. Some answers were already known. And they were set aside not because they failed, but because they didn't align with the incentives of the systems that replaced them. This pattern is not limited to agriculture. It appears in health, energy, housing, and education. When a solution reduces dependence, it rarely receives sustained support. When it requires ongoing purchase, it scales rapidly. That doesn't make the alternative wrong. It makes it inconvenient. The 1975 report still exists. The words are still there. The data has not been erased. What disappeared was implementation. and implementation disappears when independence replaces profit. If this information reached you, it's because systems are not perfect. Knowledge leaks. Curiosity survives. People still ask questions. If this mattered to you, engaging with it tells the system it matters. If you share it, you pass along something that was quietly sidelined for decades. And if you choose to follow this channel, you are not signing up for entertainment. You are joining an ongoing archive of practical knowledge that reduces dependence and increases capability. In the next video, we will look at a grain that reseeds itself every year. No replanting, no seed purchases. It was so incompatible with industrial agriculture that entire regions classified it as a weed. The knowledge never disappeared. It was documented, stored, and ignored. Now you know where to look.